In this section, we'll be talking a little bit about unconscious bias, specifically thinking about how the unconscious bias of other folks can influence us. So not necessarily thinking about what our unconscious biases are, but what are some strategies that we can take if we feel victimized by unconscious bias in some other ways. Specifically thinking about unconscious bias within STEM, as us as scientists, as us as practitioners of science, and women of color. So we talked a little bit about earlier in the other section about decision-making power. So thinking about how we can address unconscious bias in the room by making higher level changes. But chances are that as women of color, as people who are in the marginal societies or parts of STEM, we don't necessarily have that authority. We're not usually in the room to make those higher level decisions. Usually these rooms look a lot like this. Usually male, usually white, usually not us. And these are people in the room who are making decisions about us without us actually there. So how can we address that? So we've talked a little bit about cultural spaces that we occupy and the identities we occupy. And I wanted to throw out another question for you. How do these cultural identities that we've already identified inform other folks' biases against us? So how does being a woman, being a man, being a woman of color, being a gender minority, etc., how do those identities influence other people's biases against us?
Quite often, I think it's almost an assumption that that person can't complete whatever is being thought of, whether it is in a role, a leadership role, or in teaching, or in having a discussion. I think it's sort of in our observations, I guess, the reality of having to justify how it is that we are able to meet those expectations, where because the assumptions early on are we can't. Either it's a language thing, oh, you're able to speak English. It's like, well, of course we are. And I mean that's just one example, but it's quite often I think has been negative.
I remember I think 3 months into grad school, people didn't think I could write very well, and then they were surprised with my first research project. I was like, I can write.
Yeah, absolutely. So the discussion that you guys are having about people's lack of expectations around your expertise, their inability to grasp that you are actually competent at what you do, that is an absolutely a relatable experience for South Asian women, especially in STEM. Does anybody else want to participate?
I know that I echo what you guys were saying about not coming across like you are not competent enough to withhold a conversation with someone who may not be of South Asian background. I know I've had that in the past but then I've also had the opposite, where I've had people assume that because I am a South Asian woman, I can associate with every other South Asian woman and somehow mentor or bring her into the conversation. And it's because you look alike, therefore you know how they feel or you know how to bring them into conversation, right? Like, can't you go and just talk to them? And and I've had that before where in my experiences, my supervisors actually come to me and said, we're interviewing so-and-so, who is one of you guys. Do you think you can sit in on that interview? And it's like, why? Do you not think that they can hold a conversation with you? Why do I need to be in the room just because they're South Asian? So there is that, I think there's two parts to it. There's the assumption that you're not competent, but then there's the other assumption that because you look alike, you must have similar experiences no matter what.
Right, and that's an excellent point. So this double-edged sword almost, right? So this notion of that you are not part of the in-group because we deem you incompetent, we deem you not capable of understanding language, whatever it is, or this notion of that because you look like these other people that you're part of that in-group. Regardless of which way your experience has been, it comes down to the lack of choice, that your stories, your narratives, your in-groups, and how you identify your experiences are not controlled by you. Right? They're controlled by some other person who's telling you what your experiences should be, where your expertise lies. Maybe for them, your expertise is in being a South Asian woman. It's not in science, it's your actual experience as a cultured person. Yes?
Yeah, and there's also two added pressures as well. One is when there's a conversation going on between, two people and they're really into it and you know a lot about that topic, you kind of thinking like, what can I say to prove to them that I'm actually competent on talking about this? So there's this added pressure for you to kind of prove yourself. But then just to echo what has been said, you also have this other added pressure of having to now be a representative for your cultural group to help out with whatever needs to be helped out with, meaning a translator. Take time off of your work, whatever you're doing, drop everything, come and help us for. There's extra responsibilities that are kind of put on you.
Right. Absolutely. So this notion that you have to justify why you're in the room, you have to justify why you're occupying space in this conversation, and this notion that you need to constantly prove yourself, and also this notion of this like added emotional labor almost that you are expected to, because you're part of this cultural group, because of you're part of this this external out group, that you have to do the burden of like facilitating the conversation between our group and this other group, right?
Out of curiosity, is that a positive spin to this? Like, I see the pressure that is on us, but what is different makes us unique. So it takes a while for us to build up on these characteristics. So you guys had any positive spins of these from perspective?
I'm just going to repeat the question. So
is that a positive spin to
yeah.
it?
So
Just curious to know,
right.
based
So
on everyone's
this
experience.
our ability to occupy both spaces, and especially our other people's reliance on our expertise as being South Asian women, is that a positive thing? So I know I have an opinion on this. Does anybody else want to?
To me, there is the positive side where it allows you to network a lot faster, and giving voice to people that may not have felt comfortable talking in such a situation where maybe they are immigrants, maybe they do find it easier to talk to someone who looks like them, who kind of understands the cultural nuances. So there is the positive spin where you do add that added level of comfort. But at the same time, there is, you sign up, there is the added responsibility as was being mentioned. So there is the positive spin, but we also have to keep in mind, like, what is your role in that situation, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't even have to do
No, I mean, obviously, I can't speak to the South Asian woman's perspective, but I can speak in general as an employer of people where we do creative stuff and we do high-tech stuff, and diversity is so fundamentally important. The minute that a group becomes monotonic, the quality of the work they do is much less interesting and much less rich. So just in general, I think the right kinds of professional situations will have respect, and there will be professional financial benefit to having diverse groups work on things. But certainly that's not speaking to the specifics of that nature of that diversity.
Right. But it is a valuable perspective that if you're on a hiring committee, or if you are in a position to employ people, then it makes sense to have a diverse workforce, to broaden out your net, if you will, to acquire all levels of expertise, all types of expertise into the room, and to have more creativity generated that way as well. So my opinion on that question, about like that question of, is there a positive spin to this? Yes, absolutely. Like, we are occupying spaces of power because of our experiences. I will never let that go. But I think it's our choice that if we want to do that kind of work, if we want to do that kind of emotional labor of seeking out other folks and helping them and being the South Asian woman expert in the room, that is a choice that we should be making. That isn't something that should be assigned to us by some external force, because it is work, and we should be compensated for that as well. So we're going to start this discussion by exploring the study where these researchers from Columbia looked at how professors from different faculties reach out to or respond to students from different cultural backgrounds. So what they did was that they emailed 6,500 professors requesting informational interviews. So basically pretending to be students from different cultural backgrounds and emailing these professors from all these different institutions, private, public, state, all of them in America, and asking them if they would meet with them to discuss their profession, their careers, their discipline, their field of study, etc. and they associated each student name with a specific gender or race. So some examples, and it's quite funny to me that these examples exist, but some examples are Brad Anderson, which I wonder what race and gender he's supposed to be. Meredith Robert, LaTanya Brown, Juanita Martinez, Deepak Patel. So again, it's very clear where these names are coming from in terms of cultural, racial, and gender background. So question for you, which names do you think got the most responses?
Anglo-Saxon.
Anglo-Saxon names. Yep, Anglo-Saxon male names, right? Like the Brad Andersons of the world. Absolutely. So which names do you think got the least number of responses?
Mei Chen.
Mei Chen.
Ethnic names.
Ethnic names, absolutely. And ethnic names, especially female ethnic names, right? So Asian women got the least number of responses.
Wait, I'm curious to know, why did you say that and not Sonali?
Because maybe it's my own known thing of that Sonali would be an Indian name and is a female, but Mei Chen could be one of either male or female, and it's hard to tell. And quite often, I think that's one of the assumptions someone responding makes is to assume you're a boy.
Yeah, it's true.
That's another side to this, but I have a
Yeah.
feeling that's
Yeah, so it's an assumption that the people who are reaching out to you aren't boys or men. Yes, absolutely. So the researchers who did the study, they wrote an article about it, and they said that we see tremendous bias against Asian students, and that's not something we expected. A lot of people think of Asians as a model minority group. We expect them to be treated quite well in academia. And I'm sure the people in this room who are Asian, of Asian descent and are in academia don't see this happening. I don't think anyone thinks that they're treated well in academia in any way. But that was an assumption, the assumption that because Asian Americans or Asian Canadians are occupying this model minority identity, that they would be treated well in the workplace and in academia. And that is clearly not the case. There's another study by Williams, Phillips, and Hall where they talk about gender bias, especially around women of color. And they identify 5 biases keeping women of color out of STEM. So I wanted to explore that a little bit further. Some of these you've already mentioned in your own experiences. So for example, one was prove it again. This notion that when you have displayed expertise once, you're expected to prove it over and over again, despite having displayed it once. And your male colleagues, your colleagues of other ethnicities might not necessarily be required to do this sort of work. So they found 2/3 of the women interviewed and 2/3 of the women surveyed reported having to prove themselves over and over again. Their success is discounted, their expertise questioned. And that is absolutely true for a lot of people in this room. The second notion or point that they wanted to talk about was the tightrope. So this notion that you have to both present yourself as feminine in order to occupy this role of being a woman in a lab space or in a scientific space, but then also being masculine to actually occupy a space of power. So how do you balance those two representations of yourself? And they found that with Asian Americans specifically, they were more likely to feel pressured in order to act more feminine. And that their presentation themselves was definitely influenced by the people around them in that way. The third is thinking about the maternal wall. So this Asian American immunologist writes, I have to fight very hard to show that I'm a good scientist as well as a good mother. This notion that you cannot be a scientist as well as a mother, and you cannot do either competently if you occupy both. This following scientist talks a little bit about this assumption that your career becomes a hobby after you become a mother, that you're actually just waiting to find a husband and have children, and that your career is just a hobby. It's not actually something that you have any actual stake in. And thinking about the tug of war as well. A lot of times there is a limited number of women in a lab space, in a meeting, in whatever professional organization you're in. And a lot of times there's actually a very limited number of spaces available for women of color. So a lot of times there's a little bit of a tug of war going on between women as well. So this notion that I am fighting other people, other women, for that one space for a woman of color. And a lot of times when you have older women who are occupying positions of authority, they have got into those positions of authority through a lot of sweat, blood, and tears. So it might seem to those women in particular that they too have to present a path embroiled in blood, sweat, and tears for other women to get there. That for them it's a rite of passage and not something to be changed, which is quite unfortunate. And finally, isolation. If you are occupying a minority space in the scientific field, you are usually occupying a space alone. So you're sometimes not invited or excluded to other social events just because you're occupying a different space. It isn't necessarily a situation of direct discrimination, but rather feeling that this minority person is not comfortable in this space, therefore we can't invite her. And a biologist knows that you don't know who you can trust, that this life of academia, this life of science has been a very lonely life indeed. And others have said that they try to divorce their personal life from their professional life because they want to maintain this authority. That this notion of humanizing themselves by telling each other or telling their male counterparts, their non-minority counterparts about their personal life somehow discounts their authority in the room. And it's not a struggle that a lot of people share. So what are some implications of the studies that I've shared, that these biases against women that keep them out of STEM?
I definitely identify with the maternal wall, the isolation, especially in my last position that I was holding. It wasn't so much, the maternal wall wasn't so much of feeling that I needed to be a mother to, and somehow like my worth would come from that. Rather, it was more of, it was not sufficient enough for me to be a scientist in that lab. I was also claimed as the lab mother. And so that there was an added responsibility that I would be the one that would take care of everyone in that position. And I'm the one that everyone needs to come to with their personal, professional, troubleshooting issues, rather than going to my male colleague at the same position, because he was someone that was seen as person who had power that we went to for only troubleshooting issues, but because I was the maternal one, I had this extra responsibility in the lab. So I definitely relate to that, which wears you down. And it is you are continually working, and even after you come home, if you're constantly getting emails about issues that are ongoing but no one else has to deal with it, especially the supervisor of the lab does not have to deal with it, I think that adds an added responsibility. And because of that responsibility, there was isolation because I would not be invited to events where because I was claimed the lab mother, you don't invite your mother to every kind of fun activity that you do because you want to let loose, but you invite your mother to more formal events. And that's how I felt. So there was this isolation, and as well as the maternal wall. And in terms of like the implications of that is exhaustion, and feeling like your scientific worth is not sufficient, and that was not a position I was willing to take, which is why I left that job. But and that's one of the reasons why, anecdotal, I don't have any statistics on this, but anecdotally why a lot of women tend to leave STEM is because of this added pressure of being the maternal one.
Yeah. It's interesting that you can be a mother at home, and then once you occupy that space personally, you're also expected to occupy that space professionally and do that added level of emotional labor for your lab group or your peers that, again, is not compensated or even acknowledged in any way. Absolutely. Yes.
So interesting you raised all of that up, and to me I was agreeing with, or I resonate with having similar experiences, but instead of my experiences being within my previous workplace, it was more with my community. In them still not believing that I was a scientist, was capable of doing certain things. And almost the attitude has been for many that I've heard their sort of comments, and I don't react to it outwardly, but internally I'm like, interesting they mentioned that. Quite often that assumption is, yes, I'm only doing this as a hobby or until something else comes along. And so they're not taking what I am wanting to do or have started doing more seriously. And that's where a lot of what you had mentioned do come up in terms of isolation or that sort of, tug of war and stuff like that. So it's almost like it's parallel, but yet it's addressing the very same things, which is shocking, I think, for me to now have not just the sort of challenges to prove to, say, everyone, but also just it starts within my own community, which is a bit of a it's not fun.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, because in our next section we are going to talk about the biases in our communities that influence us. So yes, we talk a little bit about the expectations of being a woman in the workplace, but we have those same expectations, sometimes contradictory expectations, that we are experiencing at home. And how do we manage those two identities and those two expectations? So excellent point.
I have one point to add regarding the masculine portion. Some of the people, when even at school and at work, people think that when I ask questions, I'm rather direct, because I rather find the answer in one question rather than sidestep it. And I like to know the reason of why such an action is being taken. But that is not always accepted by people, because they don't expect you to just address like, why are you doing this? I realize sometimes it threatens people, and I've learned to adjust accordingly to the person I'm talking to. But I've also realized that I like asking those questions and I'm not stopping myself. But it took a while for me to figure out at what pace and at what way I should be asking, or and when I should be listening.
Right. It's that is an excellent example of unconscious bias, right? And thinking about likability in particular. So sometimes in our cultural experiences, directness is appreciated, it's celebrated, it's even desired in some ways. But in other contexts, in other cultures, it is something that is frowned upon, that you should have a bit more of a softer edge around questions. You shouldn't be asking these harsh questions. And so when you're celebrated for something in one space and then are penalized for it in another space, that is a form of unconscious bias, right? That you are unfairly being discounted because of how you present yourself in that way.
Just as a male, I've been often praised for my directness. Hey, you're a straight shooter. Thank you for bringing that up.
I have never been called that.
Yeah. But I have noticed that my female colleagues, she's too harsh. That I have noticed that pattern in a lot of workplaces.
Right. This inconsistency of how people should behave depending on their gender identity.
For sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I wanted to actually just touch on one thing, a personal experience, as well as thinking about the broader implications of the findings from these studies. So a personal experience is that I teach a fair bit. I am not a faculty member, I'm a librarian, but I do teach courses. And there's one other librarian who is a white male, older colleague of mine who also teaches. And this one time, both he and I were teaching a class together. And after the class, a student came up to us and referred to my male colleague as professor and referred to me as Abeer. Even though we were both teaching the exact same content, we were teaching it at the exact same time to the same group of people. And it bothered me, it chipped away at me, right? And I brought it up with my male colleague and he thought it was funny. And I was like, well, it's a little unfair. So we should talk about that a little bit further. But it chipped away at me. And then you also mentioned that slowly having to do this work of emotional labor and taking care of these peers and feeling isolated and feeling this maternal tug of war chipped away at you as well. And that has driven out a lot of people of color, a lot of women of color out of this profession. And as an instructor at McMaster University, especially in the life sciences program and the biology programs that I teach in, there are a lot of female South Asian students. There are a lot of undergraduate students from these cultures. And then when I look at the faculty, when I look at the scientists who are occupying space on campus, I don't know where these undergraduate students have ended up because they're not going into those professions. And there is a discrepancy there. So what is it that is keeping these undergraduate female students from South Asia out of these spaces because they're performing admirably at the undergraduate level and then somehow just disappearing? So the broader implications of this is this, right? It's this notion or this representation of, or lack of representation of Asian women in both academia. So this is again American data, unfortunately, because Canada does not collect a lot of demographic information. So I found data from the United States, and again, it's a little bit dated, it's from 2008, but it looks at the gender and ethnic composition of doctoral scientists and engineers employed in universities and four-year colleges who are full professors, so people in academia. And a lot of times with research around Asian women, they usually group East Asian women and South Asian women together. So this data, again, groups those two under Asian women, that broader category, and you'll find that that is the lowest, the smallest demographic, right? So these women are occupying the least number of spots at universities. So low representation in academia. And that trend carries through in government as well. So again, this is from the United States from 2006. So percentage of scientists and engineers employed in governments who are in manager positions by race, ethnicity, and gender. So again, Asian women, which are both South Asian women and East Asian women, are occupying on the lower end of that as well. So, and another implication from, if you call back from the study which sent out 6,500 emails to a bunch of faculty in the United States, there has been a clear absence of mentorship opportunity for women of color, especially women of color from Asia. Which means that this lack of leadership or lack of mentorship has led to an achievement gap in the workplace as well. So what are some strategies that we can use to address unconscious bias when we feel that we are a victim of it? So what we need to do is create open, honest space for respectful dialogue. So I'm pulling this out from a Harvard review where we talked about from Honesty, Maxfield, and Grenny, and they have a couple of suggestions. So one of their suggestions is thinking about approaching this as CPR. So thinking about how you can address this at one of these levels. So is your issue about the content? Is this a one-time incident that you feel you've been unfairly victimized by unconscious bias, and how can you address it? You focus on the content of that. Or is it a series of events, a pattern that you need to address on a larger scale? And finally, how do these two, the content or the pattern of these incidences, influence your relationship with the other people in the room? So you can address and frame your argument based on these three things. Another suggestion is knowing your goal. So when you're bringing up this issue of feeling like you've been a victim of unconscious bias, knowing what you want out of that conversation. It totally makes sense that you would be angry, but what is the outcome that you want? So is it sort of you want some repentance, you want an apology of some sort, you want some structural change that you want to address, making recommendations in that area, but knowing what's the end goal that you have in mind. State your take. So think about the facts. So what was the situation? What were the facts around the situation? What was your interpretation of that situation? And then inviting dialogue from the other person to respond on how they feel, how they interpret the situation, how they interpret the facts. And then making it safe, which is bizarre sometimes when you think about these kind of conversations, but you also have to make it safe for your peers so that they are willing to open up and have safe, honest conversation with you. So again, calling out to the action, not the person. And it's absolutely okay to take your time. There have been incidences in my own life where I have felt that I was unfairly treated because of unconscious bias. And I have felt that that was way too long ago, I can't address it now. But these types of things take time for us to process. It is a level of trauma. So it's okay to take your time and come back to it. There is no statute of limitations on something like this. So in conclusion, our cultural and gender identities absolutely inform and shape others' perception of ourselves and others' unconscious biases. These biases present very big barriers for women of South Asian descent to stay and remain in the field of STEM. And finally, that we can identify strategies to address it in our own environments as well. Before I move on to the next section, I actually wanted to quickly bring back this study. So this is the study that emailed 6,500 professors from different types of names. And what they found was We also observed almost no benefits to women or minority students contacting faculty who share their demographics, which is a surprising finding to me, right? So if I am a woman, a South Asian woman, and if I reach out to a South Asian faculty member or scientist, I would have expected a positive response. Is that true for you guys?
10 years ago, if you had asked me this question, I would have been very surprised. But now I'm thinking like, you have to base your answers based on time and whether this person who's going to contact me will provide value to my project, current grant situation, and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
the answer would have changed.
Yeah.
But I also want to see the other side of the data where is that benefit of a person just randomly calling them and not stating their value. It's the conversation, how you want to graft it.
Right. It's the same email that was sent out to all the faculty, admiring their work, telling them that they wanted to meet in person, and it was from like the Brad Andersons of the world, the Mei Chens of the world. So that was what they found, that people who shared gender and ethnic identity with the faculty member that they were contacting did not receive the same level of feedback that they were expecting, which surprised me. But it also makes sense thinking about how our cultural communities can also bias us against ourselves.